Good morning and welcome to Light Reflections from First Friends. We are glad you have chosen to join us for this virtual worship service and hope you find it beneficial to your spiritual journey. We consider this an abbreviated version of our in-person meeting for worship for those wishing to join us from a distance. If this is your first time joining us, First Friends is a thriving, progressive Quaker meeting in the city of Indianapolis, Indiana. We consider ourselves a loving, inclusive, joyous gathering of people seeking to know truth under the leadership of God's Spirit. All are welcome, no matter race, age, cultural background, sexual orientation and identity, marital status, physical and mental ability, family structure, or economic circumstance. Our hope is that through this worship experience, you will discover our faith community is unlike any other, where silent meditation is as important as the spoken word, where we emphasize the importance of one's personal encounter with the divine, and where we seek to support one another as we discover truth together. Now we invite you to center down and enter this virtual worship space with us.
Good morning, friends, and welcome to Light Reflections. This week we are continuing our series on the Bible. Our scriptures for today are Matthew 15, 10-20 from the New Revised Standard Version. Then he called the crowd to him and said to them, "Listen and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles." Then the disciples approached and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees took offense when they heard what you said?" He answered, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. And if one blind person guides another, both will fall into a pit." But Peter said to him, "Explain this parable to us." Then he said, "Are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles. For out of the heart comes evil intentions, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile." Well, some might say that the text for today is a post-COVID nightmare. To have Jesus suggest that eating with unwashed hands does not defile could be both words of heresy and a public health crisis today. Now, I know there are studies that show both good and bad aspects of washing our hands and using hand sanitizer all the time. But that's not really the point that Jesus is addressing this morning. Actually, this was more about defilement and law-keeping, which kept the Pharisees and religious leaders of Jesus' day considered unfit to associate or fellowship with, away from their contact. Yes, you heard that correctly. Washing hands and eating the proper food kept at distance the people the Pharisees did not want to associate with. This is what we call today discrimination. Sometimes I'm surprised at what all we can find in the Bible. But it's important to explore these things to help us get a better picture of how we are to live like Jesus. As I said a few sermons ago, Jesus often is found re-explaining or even reinterpreting the understanding of scriptures or teachings of the religious leaders of his day. This is just one great example of Jesus shifting the understanding and exposing the problem with what the religious leaders of his day were doing. Hear what Jesus says. Listen and understand. It's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it's what comes out of the mouth that defiles. In one of the commentaries I read about this text, it said that in Jesus' day, defilement meant being unfit for fellowship with God and his people. Instead, Jesus points out that the deep down evil defiles a person, not the food they eat. Boy, I think that had the disciples kind of freaking out. So much so they thought it was time to pull Jesus aside and let him know that he was offending the religious leaders. I'm sure they thought that they were doing the right thing. Maybe it sounded something like this. Peter, under his breath, says, "Oh, goodness, we better warn Jesus because, well, I don't want to be in trouble by association." An issue I believe Peter actually deep down struggled with. Peter then leans over to James and says, "Jesus knows that he needs to soften his message, right? Or maybe we need to help spin his words to make them say more of what the Pharisees want to hear. At this rate, he's going to get crucified. We better help him." So they proceeded to interrupt his message and warn him. But Jesus is hard-pressed to continue. Folks, even though often the church can be bold and not willing to back down, there is still a part of the church which is notorious for what is labeled nicing things over and simply not wanting to offend someone or cause trouble. By softening our message or not challenging one another, we can easily find that we struggle to have a message of hope for our world. Quakers have been accused of moving in this way over time, and I'll be honest, I think it is having an impact today. The great things our Quaker ancestors did seem like great history back then. But what are we doing today? Hugh Osgood wrote a book about the query, "Is niceness killing the church?" He wrote that the church was never designed to be held together with polite optimism. And then asked, could a greater biblical awareness help uncover the truth and robust unity Jesus spoke of? I think he's making a good point. It is important for us to allow the ministry and life of Jesus we read in the scriptures to teach us and even change us. So back to our story. Yes, the Pharisees were probably just a bit taken aback by Jesus' words. They were challenging, not polite optimism. The Pharisees knew what Jesus was implying by speaking of removing these unnecessary laws and prohibitions. The food laws were actually in the Torah, the scriptures. So some may say, well, Jesus already had committed theological suicide. He told them that Something in their sacred text didn't apply anymore, and that was a no-no. Obviously, the disciples had reason to be concerned. Yet Jesus' response is kind of multi-layered, and we must remember the crowd, which was still gathered around, most likely included the religious leaders, followers, naysayers, as well as the disciples. Boldly and shockingly, Jesus quickly dismissed the religious leaders and said their work was not God's work. Actually, he even went further, and translators put it in a derogatory label of the time, probably from a poem they heard by Horace, saying they were just blind leading the blind. Jesus was definitely not nicing it over, especially if translators chose that phrase. Those listening must have been asking, "What are you talking about, Jesus?" He just slammed the religious leaders at the core of their being. In another version of the text, it is translated that Jesus said, "Just forget them," or "let them go." And he didn't stop there. He implies that they should let them go, but also forgive them. Because really, they're just the blind leading the blind. That may actually have been the biggest insult to the religious leaders, to ask his followers to forgive them for their sins. I believe by this point, Jesus has offended just about everyone in the room with his words. No longer can Peter stay quiet and proceed to ask, "Jesus, you have some explaining to do." So Jesus addresses Peter by talking specifically about the mouth, something I believe Peter could again understand. Jesus says, "Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart. And this is what defiles. For out of the heart comes evil intentions and murder and adultery and fornication and theft, false witness and slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile." One commentary says that Jesus appears to anticipate Sigmund Freud's formulation of the id by about 1800 years in this one statement. Yet more likely what Jesus was doing for us was reinterpreting the Ten Commandments in the list he gives. Evil intentions, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander, all things that brew down deep in our hearts. And when they surface, break our fellowship with God and our neighbors. If you notice, what Jesus is doing is prepping his listeners for an even more radical summary of the Ten Commandments, when he takes them down to simply two: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. A summary that he not only simplified, but added to. He adds as yourself to emphasize how hard it truly is and how it must come from a change within us. Jesus makes it clear that all these silly laws are simply keeping one from fellowship and acceptance of their neighbors. Jesus is saying, eat what you want, and if you don't want to wash your hands, then so be it. But don't use it to discriminate against your neighbor. Know what is in your heart and share it through loving one another. Now let's be honest. Niceness can be a huge problem within the church. But the church has been kind of notorious for creating another problem: making hoops to jump through to be accepted by the church. I don't think it was ever Jesus' intent to use the Bible or his teachings to keep people away or to create barriers to knowledge or growth. I believe Jesus wanted diversity. He wanted everyone at the table. He did not want a country club or gated community, but rather a community where everyone was seen and heard and accepted and loved as you would want to be seen, heard, accepted, and loved. Or as the late Rachel Held Evans put it, this is what God's kingdom is like: a bunch of outcasts and oddballs gathered at a table, not because they're rich or worthy or good, but because they are hungry, because they said yes, and there's always room for more. As I've been hearing your stories, many of you gave up on jumping through hoops or breaking down barriers and not being accepted by other churches. You realized the niceness was a cover-up, or you were never being invited into the conversation. Some of you even saw the way the church discriminated in history and said, enough is enough. Well, in 27 years of ministry, I've encountered and sadly participated many times unaware in all kinds of this isolation and discrimination in the church, often utilizing a specific understanding of the Bible or doctrines to keep certain people away. And it disturbs me deep down, because I have been challenged to look deep by Jesus at how I have discriminated and still discriminate. A few years ago, James Watkins put together a top 10 list of the discriminations he found in the church. Sadly, I've seen every one of these in the church, and I'm fully dedicated to working on breaking down any of these barriers and hoops that still exist for us at First Friends. I challenge you to ask yourself as I read these, how many have been part of your journey? Or how many have you seen? Number 10, age discrimination. Number 9, tastes or preferences, especially musical discrimination. 8, physical, developmental, intellectual, congenital, and invisible disabilities discrimination. Number 7, levels of education discrimination. Number 6, denominational affiliation and or doctrinal beliefs discrimination. Number 5, gender and sexuality discrimination. 4, married, divorced, single, and celibate discrimination. 3, politics and ideology discrimination. 2, economics discrimination, as well as what we often think of at first, 1, race and nationality discrimination. It was Brian McLaren who put this all into perspective. He said, as a committed Christian, I have always struggled with locked doors. Doors by which we on the inside lock out the others. Jews, Muslims, Mormons, liberals, doubters, agnostics, gay folks, whomever. The more we insiders succeed in shutting out others, the more I tend to feel locked in, caged, trapped. I think that's exactly what Jesus was trying to help his followers and the religious leaders of his day to understand. But this also means if we are going to stand up to locking doors and discrimination and unacceptance and not get caged in ourselves, we're going to need to start by taking a deep look inside ourselves and in our meeting. And this will take some work. So I'm simply going to leave you with 2 queries to ponder this morning as we enter waiting worship. In what ways do I discriminate in my daily life? My family, my workplaces, my school, my neighborhood, and even my meeting? In what ways do we at First Friends, spoken or unspoken, discriminate to keep ourselves comfortable as a meeting?
Draw the welcome circle wider, gather friends and strangers in, formed of holy breath and stardust, born of God, we all are kin. From the hedgerows and the highways, summon each unlikely guest. Bid the hungry eat their fill, all the weary find their rest. Draw the welcome circle wider, gather friends and strangers in, formed of holy breath and stardust, born of God, we all are kin. Doors upended serve as tables, where the guests prepare to dine. Justice is their righteous fare, while mercy is their richest wine. Draw the welcome circle wider, gather friends and strangers in, formed of holy breath and stardust, born of God, we all are kin. All our refugees together, all our wanderers welcome home, greeted by God's open arms, with each unique but none alone. Draw the welcome circle wider, gather friends and strangers in, formed of holy breath and stardust, born of God, we all are kin. Streaming through the arching gateway in a bright celestial throng, saints from ages gone before us lead the joyous banquet song.
We close this time of worship with a Quaker prayer. God, open our eyes and unstop our ears, that we may see your light and may hear your heartbeat, reflecting and resounding within our chests, in those of all our neighbors, near and far, in all creatures and plants, and in the ground we walk upon. When we finally are able to yield to the leading of your rhythm and flow, may we come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of you in all. Amen. Have a great week, friends.